Kuwait wants to be ranked among the top 35 countries in the world by 2035, and construction will, of course, play an important role in national development and modernisation plans, which are all geared towards achieving this goal, which is dubbed New Kuwait. My name is Oscar Russo. You're listening to Construction Week Viewpoint, and I'm joined again, as always, by Jack Ball. Jack, it's great for you to be back here again.
Oscar, thank you for having me. Always a pleasure to be back.
Yeah, it was cool. So, I thought in this podcast, Jack, we could talk about the New Kuwait plan. Obviously, Construction Week just finished its Leaders in Kuwait, Leaders in Kuwait Summit 2018.
Indeed.
Very fascinating, where we had a range of different speakers from the public and private sector talking about how Kuwait needs to kind of like ramp up its infrastructure, ramp up its construction. Bring me up to speed and bring maybe up our listeners up to speed on what New Kuwait actually is.
So, Oscar, New Kuwait was announced, I believe, in January 2017, and it's a desire from the leadership in Kuwait to boost the economy, diversify productivity, and press ahead with kind of economic and financial reforms. And a lot of that is built around mega projects. So a lot of in the same vein, slightly as Saudi's plan. It's also to boost the private sector and also potentially bring in more Kuwaitis into these projects, and also the private sector.
Yeah, exactly. And just touching on that as well,
Sure.
You mentioned Saudi Arabian. We're seeing these kind of like nationalized vision strategies rolled out in Saudi, rolled out in Kuwait, and so 2035 is pretty much very similar to the Saudi Vision 2030 plan.
Yeah,
now,
absolutely.
It's all about kind of like long-term, as you said, economic diversification, moving away from oil, and New Kuwait wants to essentially make Kuwait a financial and trade center that attracts foreign direct investment. What I thought was interesting about the project, I mean, there's a lot of interesting things about the initiative, but one I find interesting is that under a new law for planning from 2016, all state-owned enterprises in Kuwait are required by law to participate in the development plan, which is kind of interesting. So you're seeing a lot of work from the private sector as well going into this project, as well as work in the PPP. But just touching on essentially what the development plan covers. Now, at Leaders in Kuwait, the keynote speech was obviously given by Talal Al-Shamari, who is the Assistant Secretary General for the Supreme Council for Planning and Development in Kuwait. Now, he was talking about New Kuwait, and there are essentially 7 pillars that prop up the policy. Now, those pillars are about developing a creative human workforce, achieving effective governance, building a diversified and a sustainable economy, as of course you've touched on before, modernising infrastructure, which is where construction is going to play a vital role, developing a sustainable living environment, upgrading and building kind of high-quality healthcare, and of course becoming an attractive investment hub. And this is really key. Kuwait wants to, you can see it looking at somewhere like Dubai, which has become a key finance centre in the Middle East. You can see Kuwait kind of eyeing up Dubai there.
No, it's very interesting, and these plans are obviously incredibly ambitious. And as you mentioned before, construction has a really pivotal role to play in this vision. He also touched on at our event last week, Oscar, I know you remember, he talked about the amount of projects that are now in the pipeline and the amount of money being spent. He touched on, or he stated actually, that there are 140 development projects in the pipeline, of which 25 haven't started, 70 are in the operational phase, and 40 are in the prep phase. And total funding is estimated up to nearly 14.5 billion US, of which 526 million has already been spent. So these numbers, again, are astronomical. They're really big, and that's a good chunk. 526 million out of the 14.5 billion. That's a good number in terms of projects already having started.
Absolutely, and on that point as well, Jack, while Talal said that construction is booming, I think it's important to mention that actually, kind of the number of projects, 140 in the development phase, there were actually 149 in the development phase in 2017, 2018, last year when the policy was announced. So while the number of projects is kind of like down slightly, the amount of capital pumping into these development projects has actually increased quite markedly from the 9.8 billion that was going into the pot, as it were,
absolutely.
last year. So you can definitely see that construction is kind of picking up pace in Kuwait.
And obviously, and I know, Oscar, you discussed and we've discussed as a team with various contacts, at the event about the role of the private sector in this, and also the role of the expat and the foreign international community in helping to achieve this vision. Can you tell me a little bit more about that, mate?
Well, it's one of those kind of like age-old issues that not just Kuwait's going to face, but Saudi will face, the UAE faces, Bahrain, to a lesser extent as well, faces, which is, do you bring in international companies with, international expertise who've worked on projects in multiple countries, or do you rely on local contractors and local firms who have better familiarity with the market, better understanding of the cultural norms and values that some of these countries hold dear? And how do you square both of those? Because on the one hand, like the international companies will give you scale, operational efficiency, local contractors, best practice. Yeah. Potentially not to say that Kuwaiti firms or Saudi firms don't operate to best practice. But there are elements that you could understand that make it kind of more palatable to bring an international contractor on board for some of these projects. And it was one of those, those points at the summit that I found really fascinating. So, you will remember when Ahmed Jamal Jafar from Bruckner Construction Contracting, we were talking about the Islands project in Kuwait, which is a plan to kind of, and actually what's interesting about this plan is China sees the island project as like a key part of its Belt and Road initiative as well. So there's going to be a lot of infrastructure going onto these islands to develop them, turn them into like really fantastic projects. But Ahmed said that he wanted more local companies to be given the opportunity to work on these projects, because he said that too often the work was being outsourced to foreign companies.
It's finding that balance, isn't it? And as you said before, it's by no means are you questioning the ability and the quality of local contracting companies, but bringing in potentially those international firms who have worked across the world, have managed to coagulate best practice and bring the most effective kind of processes to projects will only benefit Kuwait in the long run. And Kuwait, the leadership, has made a point of approaching such companies. For example, in September this year, US companies were invited to DC, Washington, DC, to meet with the leadership of Kuwait. And that was to discuss their role in ramping up this, their infrastructure efforts in Kuwait. 16 companies were at this meeting, and it was organised by the Kuwait Direct Investment Promotion Agency. And again, multiple MOUs were signed. So this does indicate that there is a real major willingness to engage with those companies.
I think there's definitely a willingness, and there's also definitely a desire to kind of boost private sector partnership as well. You look at some of these kind of like development goals. Part of that plan is to increase the effectiveness and the competitiveness of Kuwait's private sector. And you do that by, like you said, bringing in sometimes best practice from outside the region or outside the country to help kind of like skill up local firms. And, we've seen examples of, this kind of strategy rolled out quite effectively in the UAE and Saudi, for example, where sometimes, you'll have the big CEOs of some of these big companies will be, outside firms, will be international expats, but they will bring in local firms to work under those CEOs as well, and like really teach them how to run the business effectively. And
it's funny also, just to tap in there, when CW went to Al Arami Boulevard, which is the new mall actually that's been built in Oman, exactly, and just outside Muscat, one of the big pushes in Oman from the leadership in Oman is, again, kind of the Omanization of the workforce, or the ability to upskill the workforce. So they have actually teams who are being brought in to fulfill some of those specialist obligations in terms of MEP or any kind of resource to do with the construction. And then they have local teams attached to that who can then learn off that. And then on future projects, they'll be able to fulfill that kind of need without so much the international element, which is actually a real interesting concept that they're bringing in on that specific project.
It's an interesting project, and actually just dovetailing with that as well, you look at the Duqm refinery, which is one of the largest projects underway in Oman. Now they're looking for a very, very high Omanization rate of it may be up to 70% or even higher, and they're going to create thousands of jobs as a result of this project, and they're skilling up right now the local labour market in Duqm, people who have sometimes not finished their university degrees or their college degrees, and giving them the skills that enable them to work on these projects. So I know we've kind of moved away a little bit from Kuwait.
Yeah.
It's just an interesting example of how you can work with your local resources to improve kind of the effectiveness of the private sector and improve the capabilities of the workforce, which of course is one of the 7 pillars underpinning New Kuwait, which is obviously creating a creative human capital. Now back to Kuwait, I would just want to talk about a kind of private sector participation in the plan. Now obviously, we're likely to see more of that moving ahead as they look to kind of like go up the gears in the implementation of the New Kuwait development plan. And there are certainly some laws governing public-private partnership models, which I think are kind of interesting and demonstrate the appetite in Kuwait for PPP models. So, for example, I just wanted to touch on this quickly, and it may sound a little bit like legalese. But
let's see if I understand. Let's go.
Under Article 13 of Law 116 from 2014, PPP projects with a total cost of more than $197 million US should be tendered to investors. Now, I mean, this is interesting in itself because you're obviously allowing those jobs to go out in the private market and allowing people to pump private money into those companies. But under these rules, a public shareholding company will be established for each PPP project, and the stocks will be distributed after the project is tendered and the contract is awarded to the winning investor. Now, 24% of those shares of the public entity will be owned by the project, 26% of the shares will go to the winning investor from the private sector, and 50% of the shares will be offered to citizens in equal shares. So, we were touching on this before we came on and started recording the podcast. You were saying it gives people a vested interest in Kuwait in these projects.
It definitely there was a phrase that I learned from my background in finance is they can have skin in the game. They have an invested interest in ensuring these projects are a success, and really becoming committed to it, in a very tangible way. I think that's a very positive move, actually.
It is a positive move. I mean, as well, we were talking, I wanted to bring you back to the foreign versus local expertise and the role of expats, because expats have played a fundamental role in construction projects across the GCC, but there seems to be some mixed views about where expats sit in Kuwait.
I think I was reading a couple of articles when it was announced, when the news came that the leadership, I think, had approached US companies. I think there were some in Kuwait who were touching on the fact that potentially they saw the expats presence as something of perhaps a threat, not a threat, but they were obviously pushing hard. And there's obviously some impatience. They want to see, the Kuwaitis entering that space much more quickly. And it's balancing that requirement to ensure these projects and the mega projects are a success and they're on budget as much as possible. Balancing that with, trying to increase that skill set. I think that balance is something that they're going to have to keep an eye out or really try hard to redress.
Yeah, balance is key.
Exactly.
And I think, Jack, that is probably a really good point to end on. Is there anything we've not discussed about New Kuwait that you think is important to mention? I mean, I feel like we've rattled through everything pretty quickly. What I will say is to our readers that the full speech from Talal will go up online, or at least certain parts of the speech. So look out for that in the weeks to come. There'll also be a lot more content from our Leaders in Kuwait Summit, just kind of touching on New Kuwait, touching on new infrastructure, touching on, the new oil era for Kuwait. And it's certainly exciting times ahead, but let's not beat about the bush. There are some fundamental challenges and risks involved in the project, but maybe those are outweighed by the long-term rewards if Kuwait can climb up and become one of the top 35 countries in the world. So, Jack, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Oscar.
Yeah, well, you've been listening to Construction Week Viewpoint. We hope you've enjoyed listening to it as much as Jack and I enjoyed putting it together, as we always do. If you have anything that you would like us to discuss, please do get in touch with us. Until then, thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.
Goodbye.